This reading. Nikki Kay.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to speak on this Building Amendment Bill number 4. I want to start by acknowledging the Minister, the Honourable Maurice Williamson, also to acknowledge Nikki Wagner, Chair of our Local Government and Environment Select Committee. Look, I think what's really important is to acknowledge that we have got support across the House from Labor and the Green Party. I do recognise Andrew Williams and the contribution that he has made, but I think it is important as well to take a step back and look at the history in this area. So we know that there was significant reform in 2004, and I want to acknowledge Clayton Cosgrove and Shane Jones for the contribution that they made. But I do want to address an issue that was raised by Phil Twyford previously in the debate. He said leaky homes was ground zero. He made a number of comments about the 90s, but you know what he never mentioned, Mr Speaker? He never mentioned that the last Labor government actually denied that there was a leaky homes crisis. I was a researcher at the time in this building, and I watched for a significant period of time when the last Labor government actually wouldn't even acknowledge that it was an issue. And I do want to say, subsequently, there was reform in 2004, but I do want to correct that piece of history because I think it is important for this debate. I also want to the member opposite is making comments about the weather-tight resolution service. What that member doesn't realise is that I actually was a researcher that helped draft a piece of legislation which went to Michael Cullen, which formed the basis of the weather-tight resolution service. So she may not be aware of that. She may not be aware of that. Secondly, I just want to talk as well about the contribution to the sector that the construction industry does make. It's worth $20 billion. 170,000 people are employed in the construction sector. It's worth 5% of our GDP. So we need to acknowledge this evening how important this sector is to New Zealand. But also, I want to touch on some of the comments that have been made about the Canterbury rebuild and housing affordability in Auckland. We know that it's very important to have this legislation through the House, but also the reform around the RMA, because we have several significant issues in New Zealand. Part of the issue is around what is the best regulatory environment. The other issue is around the RMA Act and whether we've got our consenting provisions right. But the key thing that I want to mention, and it's actually mentioned in the regulatory impact statement, is that this has been driven by a number of things that didn't happen in 2004. And I want to read this statement from the regulatory impact statement. While consumer support was emphasised in the Building Act 2004, through a purpose statement and implied warranties, no specific measures were included to assist consumers to understand their rights, enforce their rights, or hold practitioners to account other than through the disputes tribunal and the courts. So I think that is a very important point, because all of the provisions within this legislation make a number of changes which are targeted to ensure that consumers can enforce their rights. And I just want to mention some of those changes. So we are obviously focusing on three things. The first is there is going to be a bit of stick there. So we're going to increase the penalties from $100,000 to $200,000 for failing to comply with building consent requirements. The second thing that we are going to do is to ensure that there are written contracts for residential work, and that is about, again, protecting the consumer. The third thing that we are going to focus on is to ensure that building contractors are more accountable by requiring disclosure of information that will include information about their company and the people who carry out work and their track record. And I think that's a really important point, because we need to ensure that there is greater transparency around those practitioners that are out there. Mr Speaker, look, I'm pleased to be supporting this legislation. I think the key and the major change of this legislation is that homeowners are going to be able to better identify the difference between a professional and what may be considered someone who is not a professional in this industry. I think we need to recognise the huge contribution that the construction industry make to New Zealand, 5% of our GDP. I think we also need to reflect on our history, and we need to be honest about that history, the contribution that has been made by the last Labor government, but also the fact that the reason that we are here is that there wasn't the ability in the 2004 reform to ensure that consumers were adequately protected. That's why I'm glad that there is support across the House to be able to address this, and it will go to Select Committee. I'm very pleased to support this legislation to the House. Thank you.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
I thought that was an extraordinary contribution.